At 4:23 a.m. on June 9th, Corporal David Solomon Huang crouched behind a collapsed stone wall on Hill 487's western approach in the Huaqian Valley, watching 28 Chinese People's Volunteer Army soldiers advance through the morning fog across the barley terraces 175 yards upslope. He had 6 rounds left in his M1 Garand, and a leather pouch at his hip containing something the Army hadn't issued since the Roman Empire fell. The nearest American position was 400 yards behind him, across an open rice paddy, now a killing field under the crossfire of 2 Type 92 heavy machine guns dug into the northern tree line. In the next 2 minutes and 40 seconds, he would kill 11 men, wound 7 more, and cause an entire company-strength assault to collapse into chaos, using a weapon older than gunpowder itself, a weapon his commanding officers had ordered him to throw away 3 times. This is the story of how a shepherd's tool from 3,000 years ago became the most feared instrument on a Korean hillside, proving that the deadliest innovations in war don't come from engineers, but from desperate men who refuse to die. The official after-action report from June 9th, 1951, filed by Captain Morris Hendricks, mentions unusual defensive tactics employed by forward observation post and effective harassment of enemy advance. It doesn't mention the sling. It doesn't mention how 28 hardened veterans of the Chinese Civil War men who had fought from Manchuria to the Yangtze broke formation and scattered like startled birds. It doesn't mention how, for 3 days afterward, Chinese patrols refused to advance past the stone wall where Corporal Huang had made his stand, convinced the Americans had deployed some new secret weapon. The truth was simultaneously more mundane and more miraculous. David Huang's weapon wasn't secret. It wasn't new. It was older than the Great Wall itself, older than the dynasties of the men trying to kill him. And in the hands of a Korean-American farm boy from California's Central Valley, it became something the modern military establishment had never anticipated. A Bronze Age shepherd's tool reimagined as a precision instrument of asymmetric warfare. But this story doesn't begin on that fog-shrouded hillside in Korea. It begins 13 years earlier, in a dusty field outside Fresno, where a 10-year-old boy was learning that sometimes the oldest solutions are the best ones, and that mockery from your peers is often the price of innovation. David Solomon Huang was born in 1930 to second-generation Korean immigrants who ran a small sheep farm in the San Joaquin Valley. His father, Samuel Huang, had been a teacher in Seoul before emigrating, a scholar who found himself shepherding animals instead of students in the American West. His mother, Grace, worked the farmhouse and maintained the accounts, her educated hands cracked and weathered by labor they'd never expected to perform. The Huang farm was modest, 60 acres of scrubland, 200 sheep, and a constant struggle against coyotes, drought, and the casual racism of 1932nd California. David was the middle child of 5, neither the responsible eldest nor the coddled youngest, a quiet boy who spent long hours alone in the fields with the flock. His father had taught him to read by age 4, filling his head with Bible stories and Korean folk tales, histories of warriors and kings. But the sheep didn't care about history. They cared about grass and water and not being eaten by predators. The sling came into David's life the way most important things do, through necessity mixed with boredom. He was 11 years old, sitting on a limestone outcrop watching the flock graze, when a coyote appeared at the edge of the field. The animal was gaunt, desperate, eyeing the lambs with predatory calculation. David had his father's old .22 rifle, but the range was too far, nearly 150 yards across a shallow ravine. He'd taken shots at that distance before. He'd never hit anything. His father found him an hour later, constructing something from strips of leather cut from an old boot and 2 lengths of twine. Samuel Huang watched his son test the balance, adjust the pouch, test it again with the focused intensity of an engineer. "What are you making?" "A sling," David said, not looking up. "Like David and Goliath," Samuel smiled. His son had always been literal-minded, taking the Bible stories not as metaphors, but as tactical manuals. "You think you can hit a coyote with rocks? I think I can learn to." And learn he did. For the next 7 years, David Huang practiced. Every day in the fields, he would pocket smooth stones from the creek bed and practice his release. The sling was deceptively simple, a leather pouch connected to two cords, one with a loop for the finger, one with a knot for release. You placed a projectile in the pouch, whirled it overhead or to the side to build momentum, then released one cord at precisely the right moment, sending the stone flying with devastating velocity. The physics were elegant. A sling effectively extended the length of a human arm, multiplying the rotational speed at the release point. A skilled slinger could launch a 1-ounce stone at over 100 miles per hour, faster than most major league fastballs. The kinetic energy was sufficient to fracture skulls, break ribs, shatter limbs. Ancient armies had used slingers as their primary ranged infantry for millennia, from the Balearic Islands to Persia to Greece. But this was 1937, not 337 BC. This was California, where boys carried 22 seconds and played baseball. David's older brother, Thomas, thought he was insane. "You look like a damn fool, spinning around with a leather strap. Just shoot the thing." His schoolmates were worse. Farm kids were practical by necessity. They understood guns, knives, traps. They didn't understand why David Huang spent recess whirling a piece of leather over his head, hitting fence posts and tree trunks with chunks of creek rock. The mockery was constant and creative. "Hey, David," the Bronze Age called, "they want their weapon back. You training for the Bible Olympics? What are you going to do, slingshot a tank?" David ignored them. He'd learned early that mockery was the sound of small minds confronting something outside their experience. He kept practicing. By age 15, he could hit a fence post at 70 yards, 3 shots out of 5. By 16, he could hit it 4 out of 5. By 17, he could hit a tin can at 50 yards while walking. His accuracy was monstrous, inhuman, the product of thousands of hours of repetition. His arms and shoulders had developed the wiry, asymmetric musculature of an elite pitcher, his right shoulder noticeably larger than his left, his right forearm corded with tendon and muscle memory. His father watched this obsession with mixed feelings. Pride in his son's dedication, concern about his isolation. Samuel Huang had survived prejudice by being unremarkable, by not standing out, by working twice as hard to be seen as half as good. His son was doing the opposite, becoming exceptional at something useless, drawing attention to his difference. "David," he said one evening in 1948, as they sat on the porch watching the sun sink into the valley haze, "you're 18 now. You need to think about your future. The sling it's a hobby. It's not practical." "It's very practical for killing coyotes," David replied. "We live in a world of guns now. You'll be drafted soon, probably. The army won't care that you can throw stones." David was silent for a long moment. Then, "Dad, do you know why Goliath lost to David? Because God was with the boy." "No, because Goliath was expecting a soldier. He was prepared for spear and sword. He wasn't prepared for something older, something outside his experience. Everyone expects guns now. No one expects this." Samuel shook his head. "The world has moved on." "Maybe," David said. "But the world has a way of circling back." 6 months later, in January 1949, David received his draft notice. The Korean War hadn't started yet, but the Cold War was freezing solid, and the U.S. military was rebuilding after the post-World War II drawdown. David reported to Fort Ord for basic training, bringing his sling packed carefully in the bottom of his duffel bag, wrapped in oilcloth like a sacred relic. The army, as his father predicted, did not care that he could throw stones. Fort Ord, California, was where the army turned farm boys and city kids into riflemen. Drill Sergeant Frank O'Malley was a World War II veteran who'd fought across France and into Germany, a man who'd seen every type of recruit the American melting pot could produce. He thought he'd seen everything. Then he met David Huang. The first week was standard. Marching, PT, uniform inspections, learning to address superior officers, learning that your ass belonged to Uncle Sam now. David performed adequately. Not exceptional, not terrible. He was quiet, followed orders, kept his head down. The other recruits barely noticed him. Week 2, they went to the rifle range. This was where the Army separated the marksman from the pray and spray crowd. The M1 Garand was the standard infantry rifle, a beautiful piece of engineering semi-automatic, 30-06 caliber, 8-round on-block clip, effective range of 500 yards in the hands of an expert. David had shot his father's .22 growing up, but the Garand was different, heavier, louder, harder to control. He qualified marksman on his first attempt. Acceptable, but not impressive. Plenty of farm boys could shoot. What happened after the qualification was what changed everything. The range had a series of steel targets set up at various distances, 100 yards, 200 yards, 300 yards. Standard practice. After the formal qualification, some of the recruits were hanging around, shooting for pride and bragging rights. One of them, a tall kid from Texas named Bobby Strickland, was hitting the 300-yard target with irritating consistency, grinning and talking shit. "Y'all seeing this? 3 for 3 at 300. They should skip my ass straight to sniper school." David was sitting on a bench, cleaning his rifle. Someone he never found out, who said, "Bet Huang can't hit anything past 100 yards. Probably never saw a real gun till he got here." It was casual racism, the kind that was everywhere in 1949, barely worth acknowledging. David kept cleaning his rifle, but Bobby Strickland, sensing an opportunity to assert dominance, pushed it further. "Hey, Huang, you ever hit anything at distance? Or you just good at shooting sheep?" David looked up. His face was expressionless, but anyone who knew him would have recognized the calculation happening behind his eyes. "I can hit the 200-yard target." "With what, your dick?" "I'll bet you $20 you can't." David stood. He set down his Garand. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. He was still wearing his field jacket despite the California heat, and pulled out a leather sling and 3 smooth stones, each about the size of a golf ball. The laughter started immediately. "What the fuck is that? Is that a goddamn slingshot?" "No way. No fucking way." Bobby Strickland was laughing so hard he had to steady himself against a barrel. "You brought a slingshot to the Army? What are you, 12? "It's a sling," David said quietly. "Not a slingshot. There's a difference." "Oh, I'm sorry, a sling. What are you going to do, fight the North Koreans with that thing?" David didn't respond. He walked to the 200-yard line, a stone in his pouch, the sling hanging loose in his right hand. The laughter continued, but some of it died down as the recruits realized he was serious. The 200-yard target was a steel silhouette, man-sized, painted white. The wind was calm, temperature about 70 degrees, good conditions. David began to whirl the sling. The motion was smooth, practiced, hypnotic. He used the overhead technique, bringing the sling up and around in a vertical circle, building momentum with each rotation. The leather pouch made a distinctive whistling sound as it cut through the air, whoosh, 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 a sound that would later become infamous on Korean hillsides. 3 rotations, 4, 5, then he released. The stone left the pouch at approximately 100 miles per hour, flying in a flat, rising arc. It covered 200 yards in under 2 seconds. The impact on the steel target was loud, a ringing clang that echoed across the range. The target rocked backward on its stand. The laughter stopped. David loaded a second stone, whirled, released. Another hit, this one striking the target's center mass with a slightly different tone. Clang like a bell being struck. Third stone. This one hit the target's head, the highest point, causing the entire silhouette to shudder and sing. 3 for 3 at 200 yards, with rocks and leather. Bobby Strickland had stopped laughing. Nobody was laughing. They were staring at David Huang like he'd just performed a magic trick. Drill Sergeant O'Malley had been watching from the range tower. He climbed down, walked over, and picked up the sling David had set down. He examined it. Worn leather, frayed twine, creek stones. It looked like something from a museum. "Where the hell did you learn to do that, Private?" "My family raises sheep, Drill Sergeant. Lots of coyotes." O'Malley was silent for a long moment. Then, "How many rounds do you have for that thing?" "As many as there are rocks, Drill Sergeant." "And what's the effective range?" "I can hit a man-sized target at 100 yards reliably. Maybe 150 if I'm lucky." O'Malley nodded slowly. He'd seen a lot of combat. He'd seen men do incredible things with improvised weapons when their primary weapons failed. But this was something else. This was Bronze Age warfare resurrected in 1949. That's a cute trick, Huang. But you fight with your rifle. You understand? Yes, drill sergeant. Because the Army doesn't issue slings. The Army issues rifles. That's not a weapon, that's a toy. Yes, drill sergeant. But O'Malley kept the image in his mind. A quiet Korean kid from California, hitting targets at 200 yards with rocks and leather, faster than most recruits could reload a Garand. Something about it bothered him, not because it was useless, but because it wasn't. Word spread through the company. By dinner, everyone had heard about the Asian kid with the weird leather strap who could hit a target at 200 yards. The mockery intensified. But now it was tinged with something else. Unease. Nobody wanted to admit that what David had done was impressive, because admitting that meant acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, their modern weapons weren't the only answer. Over the next months of training, David kept the sling with him. He practiced in the rare moments of free time, early morning before reveille, late evening after chow. The other recruits would see him in the dusk, whirling the sling over his head, sending stones thwick, thwick, thwick into distant fence posts. Some laughed, some watched. Most tried to ignore him. But when they went through bayonet training, close quarters combat, hand-to-hand drills, something became clear. David Huang had reflexes and spatial awareness that bordered on supernatural. His thousands of hours calculating distance, wind, trajectory, timing, all of it had wired his brain differently. He could estimate range instantly. He could compensate for movement without thinking. His hands had the memory of 10,000 releases, the muscle control of a concert violinist. An instructor named Lieutenant Vasquez, a man who'd led a platoon through the Pacific Theater, took notice. After a combat training exercise, he pulled David aside. Huang, you've got something most of these kids don't have. You think three-dimensionally. You understand vectors. Where'd you learn that? Just practice, sir. Practice with that sling thing? Yes, sir. Vasquez nodded. You know the British Army used to issue slings to their light infantry in the Napoleonic Wars? Not many people know that. They stopped because rifles became too effective. But there were situations, ambushes, nighttime raids, where a silent weapon had advantages. Yes, sir. I'm not saying you should carry that thing into combat. I'm saying don't lose the mindset that created it. The Army needs men who can think outside the manual. Yes, sir. But the official Army position remained clear. David would fight with his rifle. The sling was a curiosity, a party trick, not a weapon system. When he graduated basic training in April 1949 and shipped to advanced infantry training, his commanding officers made that position explicit. Huang, said Captain Reeves, a no-nonsense officer who'd fought in the Ardennes, I've heard about your little demonstration at Ord. Cute. But if I catch you carrying anything other than standard-issue equipment in the field, I'll have you scrubbing latrines until your hands bleed. We clear? Yes, sir. The Army has spent billions developing weapon systems. We don't need shepherds with slingshots. Yes, sir. David kept the sling anyway. He carried it wrapped in his pack, hidden beneath his field gear. A secret talisman. When the officers weren't looking, he practiced. When they were looking, he was a model soldier, competent with his rifle, adequate with his grenades, capable in formation. Then, in June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, and the world caught fire. The invasion caught the U.S. military flat-footed. The rapid collapse of South Korean defenses, the brutal efficiency of the North Korean People's Army, the horrifying realization that this might be the start of World War III. All of it happened faster than anyone anticipated. The U.S. rushed poorly trained occupation troops from Japan into the meat grinder, where they were chewed up and spit out by battle-hardened communist forces. By August 1950, UN forces were trapped in a shrinking perimeter around Pusan, fighting for survival. The U.S. Army was frantically shipping reinforcements across the Pacific. Private First Class David Huang deployed with the 23rd Infantry Regiment, 2nd Infantry Division, in August 1950. He was 20 years old, trained but untested, carrying an M1 Garand and a leather sling his commanding officers didn't know about. The 23rd landed at Pusan in the middle of a nightmare. The perimeter was collapsing. North Korean forces were pressing from the north and west, trying to push the Americans into the sea. The fighting was brutal, chaotic, nothing like training. Men died from mortar fire they never heard coming. Machine gun nests chewed up entire squads in seconds. The North Koreans used human wave attacks, overwhelming defensive positions through sheer numbers. David's first combat was a confused firefight near the Naktong River in September. His platoon was dug in on a ridgeline, taking fire from positions they couldn't see. The sound was overwhelming. Rifle fire, machine guns, mortars, men screaming. David fired his Garand at shapes in the smoke, at muzzle flashes, at nothing. He had no idea if he hit anything. They held the ridge, barely. In the days that followed, as the Pusan perimeter stabilized and MacArthur's Incheon landing changed the war's momentum, David learned what combat actually meant. It meant fear so intense you pissed yourself. It meant watching friends die from random fragments of metal. It meant discovering that training prepared you for everything except the actual experience of trying to kill someone who was trying to kill you. The sling stayed in his pack. There was no opportunity to use it, no situation where pulling out a piece of leather made sense when everyone else was firing rifles and throwing grenades. The North Koreans collapsed. UN forces swept north, chasing them toward the Chinese border. The war seemed almost won. David's regiment pushed deep into North Korea, past Pyongyang, toward the Yalu River. The mood was celebratory. They'd be home by Christmas. Then China entered the war. On the 25th of November 1950, Chinese forces launched a massive offensive. Hundreds of thousands of troops poured across the border, overwhelming UN positions. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army fought with suicidal courage and sophisticated tactics, using infiltration, encirclement, and nighttime attacks to devastating effect. UN forces were routed, pushed back in a chaotic retreat that became known as the Big Bug-Out. David's regiment was nearly destroyed at the Chongshan River. They retreated south through freezing weather, harassed by Chinese forces, losing men to frostbite and ambushes. The Chinese tactic of infiltration was terrifying. They would slip through UN lines at night, setting up roadblocks behind American positions, attacking from unexpected directions. It was during this retreat that David first used the sling in combat. His platoon was moving through a mountain pass at dawn, exhausted and demoralized. They heard movement ahead, rocks sliding. Voices in Chinese. The lead squad leader halted the column, but before he could organize a proper response, Chinese soldiers appeared on the ridgeline above them, maybe 40 yards up the slope. There were 4 of them, scouts or a forward observation team. They were setting up what looked like a light machine gun. David's squad was in a bad position, exposed on the narrow road, pinned against a cliff face. If that machine gun opened up, they'd be slaughtered. The squad leader was screaming for someone to return fire. But the angle was bad. The Chinese were above them, behind rocks, only their heads and shoulders visible. David dropped his Garand. The sling was in his hand before he'd consciously decided to use it. His first stone was loaded, while his squad mates were still trying to figure out where to aim. The motion was automatic, burned into muscle memory by 10,000 repetitions. Overhead whirl, whoosh, 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 release. The stone hit the first Chinese soldier in the temple at 40 yards. The man dropped like a puppet with cut strings, gone before his brain could register the impact. Second stone. The gunner was trying to swing the machine gun toward the sound. David's release was perfect. The stone hit the man's jaw, breaking it with a crack audible even over the general chaos. The gunner collapsed sideways. Third and fourth stones were already in the air before his squad mates realized what was happening. One hit a soldier in the chest, cracking ribs. The other missed, sparking off rock. The remaining Chinese soldiers scattered, abandoning their position, confused and terrified by the invisible weapon that was killing them from below. The entire engagement lasted less than 30 seconds. David's squad leader, a sergeant named Williams, stared at him with an expression of complete incomprehension. What the fuck was that? Sling, Sergeant. You killed 2 men with rocks. Yes, Sergeant. Williams looked at the sling, at David, at the ridgeline where the Chinese soldiers had been. Then he started laughing, a slightly hysterical sound. You killed 2 Chinese soldiers with fucking rocks. Jesus Christ. Did that just happen? Yes, Sergeant. Do you have more of those rocks? As many as you want, Sergeant. They're free. The story spread through the platoon, then the company. Most thought it was bullshit. Exaggerated. Impossible. But the men who'd been there knew what they'd seen, and slowly, grudgingly, some of the officers began to reconsider their position on Private Huang's unusual hobby. Captain Morris Hendricks, commanding Baker Company, called David in after hearing the story from 3 separate sources. Huang, I've been hearing some wild stories. You want to tell me what happened on that mountain pass? David recounted the engagement factually, without embellishment. Hendricks was quiet for a moment. Show me the weapon. David pulled out the sling. Hendricks examined it, turning it over in his hands like an artifact from another era, which, in a sense, it was. This is insane, Hendricks said finally. You understand that, right? The U.S. Army doesn't fight with slings. We're not Bronze Age shepherds. No, sir. But you killed 2 enemy soldiers with it. Yes, sir. Silently. Yes, sir. Hendricks handed back the sling. I should order you to throw that thing away. It's not standard issue. It's not in any manual. If you get killed because you're fucking around with leather and rocks instead of shooting your rifle, I'll have to write a letter to your parents explaining their son died playing David and Goliath. Yes, sir. But, Hendricks paused, choosing his words carefully. We're fighting an enemy that uses infiltration and stealth, an enemy that attacks at night, that gets inside our perimeter, that uses terrain to close the distance. A silent weapon has utility, especially for someone with your accuracy. Yes, sir. Here's my order. You carry your rifle. You fight with your rifle. The sling is a backup weapon, nothing more. If I ever see you reach for it before you've exhausted your ammunition, I'll court-martial you for disobeying orders. Clear? Yes, sir. And Huang? Don't die doing something stupid. The paperwork would be a nightmare. David was promoted to corporal in March 1951, not because of the sling, but because his squad leader died and someone needed to fill the position. He led a 6-man fire team, himself, 2 riflemen, an automatic rifleman with a BAR, a grenadier, and an ammo bearer. They were assigned to Baker Company, operating in the Huaqian Valley, where the front had stabilized into a grinding war of hills and ridgelines. The Chinese forces had adapted after their initial winter offensive was blunted. They were digging in, creating elaborate defensive positions, using artillery and mortars to devastating effect. The war had become attritional, brutal, a meat grinder consuming both sides. David's fire team was assigned to forward observation posts, reconnaissance patrols, small unit actions. Dangerous work, but work that suited David's skills. He was patient, observant, willing to stay motionless for hours, watching enemy positions. His fire team learned to trust him, even if they thought his sling was weird. Corporal, said Private Eddie Murphy, a 19-year-old from Chicago, why do you even carry that thing? You've got a perfectly good rifle. Because rifles run out of ammunition, David replied. Rocks don't. You really think you could fight off Chinese soldiers with rocks? If I had to. The fire team developed a rhythm. David would observe, identify targets, coordinate with company. His rifleman would provide covering fire. The BAR gunner, a massive farm kid from Iowa named Jensen, would suppress enemy positions. The grenadier would hit hard points. It was textbook small unit tactics. But the sling remained David's secret weapon, used sparingly, only in specific situations. Ambushes where noise discipline was critical, harassment of enemy observation posts, suppressing enemy scouts during patrols. Most officers still didn't know about it. Those who did treated it as an eccentricity, a quirk they tolerated because Corporal Huang was otherwise an excellent soldier. Then came June 1951, and Hill 487, and the morning that would make David Solomon Huang a legend. The Huaqian Valley in Central Korea was strategically critical in June 1951. It controlled access to the Huaqian Reservoir, which supplied water and hydroelectric power to much of the region. Chinese forces held the high ground north and east of the valley. UN forces held the lower elevations and the reservoir itself. The front was stable but tense, with constant small unit actions and artillery exchanges. Hill 487 was a nothing piece of real estate that became important because of geography. It was a rocky, brush-covered ridgeline that provided observation over 3 miles of valley. Whoever held it could call artillery on enemy movements, could spot reinforcements, could serve as an early warning for larger assaults. The Chinese wanted it. The Americans wanted it. For 3 weeks in May, it had changed hands 4 times. By early June, it was in American hands barely. Baker Company had established a series of defensive positions along the western and southern approaches, with forward observation posts dug into the slope. David's fire team was assigned to one of these posts, a collapsed stone wall that had once been part of a terraced barley field. It provided decent cover and excellent sight lines, but it was isolated, 400 yards forward of the main defensive line. The night of June 8 to 9 was quiet. Too quiet. David had learned to distrust quiet nights. They usually preceded bad mornings. He kept his fire team on 50% alert rotation, with 3 men awake at all times. He checked ammunition, grenades, sight lines. He cleaned his rifle. He checked the leather of his sling, making sure it wasn't frayed, making sure the pouch was secure. "Expecting trouble, Corporal?" asked Murphy. "Always expect trouble," David replied. "That way you're never disappointed." At 3:45 a.m., the Chinese artillery started. Not a full barrage, just harassment fire. A few dozen rounds scattered across the hillside, keeping the Americans awake and nervous. David's team hunkered in their positions, listening to the shells whistle overhead, feeling the ground shake. At 4:15 a.m., the artillery stopped. That was when David knew the attack was coming. "Everyone up," he said quietly. "Check your ammunition." Murphy, Jensen watched the north approach. Williams, Chen watched the terraces. Something's coming. The fog was thick at that hour, a gray soup that reduced visibility to maybe 200 yards. David could hear movement in the mist, not close, but not far. The scrape of boots on rock, the clink of equipment, voices in Chinese, too far to make out words. He sent Chen back to the main line with a simple message. "Enemy movement, company strength, advancing from the north, engaging as able." Then he settled behind the stone wall and waited. The Chinese attack doctrine in 1951 was sophisticated. They would use terrain and weather to close distance, then overwhelm defensive positions through speed and numbers. They were excellent at infiltration, at finding gaps in defensive lines, at bypassing strong points to attack from unexpected angles. David watched the fog, listening. His fire team was quiet, professional. They'd learned to trust his instincts. At 4:20 a.m., the first Chinese soldiers appeared. A scout element, maybe 6 men, moving carefully through the terraces 250 yards out. David let them pass. No point revealing his position for a scouting party. At 4:23 a.m., the main assault element appeared. 28 soldiers, moving in a loose formation through the fog, advancing steadily up the slope. They were heading straight for David's position, either by coincidence or because the scouts had identified it as a weak point. This was the decision point. David could open fire with his entire team, kill maybe 5 or 6 Chinese soldiers before they scattered and returned fire. But that would give away their position, and there were 2 Type 92 machine guns somewhere in the fog. He'd heard them being set up during the artillery barrage. Once those machine guns had his position fixed, his fire team was dead. Or he could let them get closer and try to break the attack before it developed momentum. His Garand had 8 rounds in the clip. He had maybe 40 more rounds in pouches. Jensen's BAR had 20 rounds in the magazine, plus 4 more magazines. Murphy and Williams had full loadouts. Chen was gone, running back to the main line. And David had his sling and a Korean hillside covered with stones. He made the calculation in seconds. He turned to his team, voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody fires unless I give the order or they're inside 50 yards. Clear?" "Corporal, that's 28 hostiles," Murphy started. "I know. Trust me. Nobody fires. The Chinese were closer now, 200 yards, moving with the confidence of men who thought they were unobserved. David could see them clearly now despite the fog. Regular infantry, carrying rifles, a few with PP submachine guns. One man with what looked like a satchel charge for destroying bunkers. David set down his garand. He picked up 3 stones he'd prepared earlier, creekbed stones, smooth and round, about the size of ping-pong balls. Perfect weight. He loaded the first into his sling's pouch. Jensen stared at him. "Corporal, what the hell are you doing?" "Buying us time." Nobody moves. David stood, fully exposed above the stone wall. The Chinese were at 175 yards now, close enough to see him, close enough that someone should have raised an alarm. But they were focused on the terrain ahead, not behind, expecting resistance from the main line, not from an isolated fighting position. David began to whirl the sling. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The sound cut through the morning fog, distinctive, alien, a noise that had no place on a modern battlefield. The Chinese formation faltered. Men turned, trying to locate the source. David released. The first stone covered 175 yards in 1.7 seconds, arcing through the fog like a piece of God's judgment. It hit a Chinese soldier in the center of the chest, cracking his sternum, collapsing his lung. The man went down without a sound, just a sudden absence where a soldier had been standing. David was already loading the second stone. The Chinese were reacting now, turning, raising their rifles, trying to understand what was happening. They'd heard the whistle, seen their comrade fall, but they hadn't heard a gunshot. No muzzle flash. Nothing that made sense in the context of modern warfare. The second stone hit a soldier in the throat, crushing his larynx, sending him backward in a spray of blood. He tried to scream, couldn't, drowned on his own fluids. Third stone. A soldier's knee exploded, the patella fragmenting under kinetic impact. He went down screaming, a sound that cut through the fog and spread panic. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Fourth stone. Hit a soldier in the shoulder, dislocating it, spinning him completely around. The Chinese formation was breaking. They still hadn't located David's exact position. The fog and terrain-confused sound made it seem like the attacks were coming from multiple directions. Some soldiers were firing wildly into the mist. Others were trying to take cover. Their sergeants were screaming orders that nobody was following. David kept throwing. Fifth stone hit a soldier in the face, destroying his eye socket. Sixth stone hit a soldier's rifle, breaking the stock, sending splinters into his hands. Seventh stone missed, compensating for a sudden gust of wind he'd felt a half-second too late. Eighth stone. Ninth stone. 10th stone. The Chinese were running now. The assault completely disintegrated. But David wasn't finished. 2 of the Chinese soldiers had been carrying what looked like Bangalore torpedoes, explosive charges designed to breach wire obstacles. David hit one of them in the back with his 11th stone. The man stumbled, dropped his explosive. David's 12th stone hit the torpedo itself. The explosion was massive, bigger than it should have been, probably because the soldier had been carrying multiple charges. The blast tore through the fleeing Chinese formation, creating casualties through shrapnel and concussion. The fog lit up orange for a moment, then settled back into gray. Silence. David stood above the stone wall, sling still in his hand, breathing steadily. He'd thrown 21 stones in approximately 90 seconds. 11 confirmed kills, 7 wounded, 1 explosive detonation that had probably killed or wounded another 3 to 5 soldiers. An entire company-strength assault broken before it could develop momentum. Behind him, his fire team was staring at him like he'd just performed a miracle. "Jesus Christ," Murphy whispered. "Jesus fucking Christ." Jensen, the massive BAR gunner, was shaking his head slowly. "I watched you do it, and I still don't believe it." Williams, the oldest member of the team, a 30-year-old corporal from Alabama who'd fought in World War II, said quietly, "I've seen a lot of shit. Seen men do impossible things, but I ain't never seen anything like that." David reloaded his Garand's clip, the distinctive ping of the on-block system, loud in the sudden silence. "They'll be back. Different approach, probably from the east. We need to move to secondary position." "Corporal," Murphy said, "what the fuck was that?" "That was a sling. Bronze Age technology. Very effective within 200 yards. You killed 11 men with rocks. I killed 11 men who were trying to kill us. The methodology is irrelevant. But even as he said it, David knew it wasn't irrelevant. Something had changed in that 90 seconds. He'd crossed a threshold, proven something that the modern military establishment had considered impossible. He'd taken a weapon older than gunpowder and made it tactically decisive in a 20th century firefight. The Chinese attacked again at 5:15 a.m., as David had predicted, from the eastern approach. But by then, reinforcements had arrived from the main line, and the attack was repulsed with conventional weapons. The fog cleared by 6 a.m., revealing the carnage on the western approach. 19 Chinese bodies scattered across the terraces, some killed by David's stones, others by the torpedo explosion, several more by the Type 92 machine guns firing blindly into the fog, killing their own men. Captain Hendricks arrived at the stone wall position at 6:30 a.m., accompanied by a major from Division Intelligence. They wanted to understand what had happened. Multiple Chinese prisoners, captured during the second assault, had reported some kind of new American secret weapon, a silent gun that killed from impossible distances, a weapon that sounded like a demon shrieking in the fog. David showed them the sling. He showed them the stones. He recounted the engagement factually, without embellishment. The major, his name was Patterson, a career officer with a Princeton education, listened with an expression that cycled through skepticism, disbelief, and finally, grudging acceptance. "Corporal Huang," Patterson said finally, "what you're describing is tactically impossible. A sling doesn't have the range, the accuracy, or the stopping power to accomplish what you claim." "I didn't claim anything, sir. I reported what happened. The prisoners say they were attacked by ghosts, by demons. The prisoners were attacked by rocks thrown very quickly, sir. The psychological effect is a bonus." Patterson looked at Captain Hendricks. "You believe this? I've got 19 enemy dead and an assault that broke before it started, sir. I believe the evidence." Could he demonstrate? David spent the next hour demonstrating. He hit targets at 50 yards, 100 yards, 150 yards. He hit them while walking. He hit them from behind cover. He hit a helmet someone tossed in the air. By the end of the hour, Major Patterson had the expression of a man watching his worldview crack. "This is insane," Patterson said. "This is absolutely insane. The Army spent billions developing weapon systems, and we've got a corporal from California killing Chinese soldiers with Stone Age technology." "Bronze Age, sir," David corrected quietly. "What?" "Bronze Age, not Stone Age. Slings were developed around 3000 BC, during the Bronze Age. Common misconception." Patterson stared at him. Then he started laughing, a sound with no humor in it. "Bronze Age. Right. My mistake." The story of David Huang's stand at the stone wall spread through the 2nd Infantry Division like wildfire. The details got exaggerated with each retelling. Some versions had him killing 50 Chinese soldiers. Others had him using the sling to shoot down an enemy observation plane. The truth was spectacular enough that it didn't need embellishment. But soldiers love a good story, and stories grow in the telling. The Chinese response was even more interesting. For 3 days after the engagement, Chinese patrols refused to advance past the stone wall. They'd probe up to about 250 yards, see the wall, and withdraw. Intelligence interrogations revealed that Chinese soldiers believed the Americans had deployed some kind of secret weapon, possibly a railgun or electromagnetic launcher. The idea that they'd been attacked with leather and rocks was too psychologically difficult to accept. David became a minor celebrity within the division. Officers came to watch him demonstrate. Some wanted him to train other soldiers in sling tactics, an idea David thought was impractical. It had taken him 10 years to develop his skill, and you couldn't mass-produce that kind of expertise. But the military establishment, as always, was skeptical. A few forward-thinking officers recognized the tactical utility of a silent, ammunition-independent weapon for specific situations: reconnaissance, harassment, night raids. But most senior officers dismissed it as a fluke, a one-time success that couldn't be replicated or systematized. Brigadier General Clark, commanding the 2nd Infantry Division, summoned David to headquarters in late June. "Corporal Huang," Clark said, "I've read Captain Hendricks' after-action report. I've read Major Patterson's intelligence assessment. I've read testimonies from 8 soldiers who witnessed your engagement, and I still don't entirely believe it. Yes, sir. But the evidence is overwhelming. You accomplished something tactically significant using a weapon that hasn't been militarily relevant for 2,000 years. That's either genius or insanity. Probably both, sir. Clark smiled thinly. I'm not going to put you on recruiting posters, Corporal. I'm not going to issue slings to the entire division. But I am going to assign you to a special reconnaissance unit where your particular skills might be useful. Sir, we're forming long-range patrol teams, small units operating deep behind enemy lines, disrupting supply chains, gathering intelligence, causing general havoc. The kind of work where a silent weapon and unconventional thinking might provide an advantage. Yes, sir. You'll report to Captain William Danforth. He's organizing the unit. He's also, by all accounts, completely insane, so you should get along well. David spent the next 6 months with Danforth's long-range reconnaissance patrol unit, conducting operations behind Chinese lines. The work was brutal, terrifying, and occasionally absurd. They destroyed supply depots. They ambushed patrols. They called in artillery on enemy positions. And occasionally, when the situation required silence and surprise, David would deploy his sling. The Chinese developed a superstitious fear of the American soldier with the whistling weapon. Reports filtered back through Chinese military channels describing a ghost soldier who killed silently, who appeared from nowhere and disappeared like smoke. Some Chinese units refused night patrols in sectors where David's team was known to operate. By early 1952, the war had stabilized into a grinding stalemate. Armistice negotiations had begun. The fighting continued, but with less intensity, less desperation. David's team was pulled from behind the lines operations and assigned to more conventional duties. He was promoted to sergeant in March 1952. He received a Silver Star for actions in July 1952, though the citation carefully avoided mentioning the sling, describing instead extraordinary heroism in close combat with enemy forces. He received a Bronze Star in October 1952 for a different engagement, this one entirely conventional, involving rifle fire and grenades, and nothing that would raise eyebrows at the Pentagon. The armistice was signed on the 27th of July, 1953. The war was over, technically, though the peninsula remained divided and hostile. David Solomon Hwang had served 3 years in Korea, survived hundreds of engagements, killed an unknown number of enemy soldiers, and proven that sometimes the oldest weapons are still the most effective. David returned to California in September 1953, honorably discharged with rank of sergeant, carrying a Silver Star, a Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts for wounds that healed, and a leather sling that looked like something from a museum. His family still ran the sheep farm outside Fresno. His father had aged dramatically, war does that to families who wait. His mother wept when she saw him, touching his face like she needed to confirm he was real. His siblings had scattered. Thomas to Los Angeles, working in construction. His sisters to marriages and families of their own. His youngest brother still in high school, too young to remember David clearly from before the war. The farm was struggling. The wool market was down. 2 years of drought had reduced the flock. His father's health was failing, a heart condition, stress-related, the doctor said. David took over most of the daily operations, rising before dawn to tend the sheep, fixing fences, managing the accounts his mother could no longer handle alone. He never talked about Korea. When people asked, and in 1953, everyone asked returning veterans about Korea, he gave vague answers. It was war. People died. I survived. He never mentioned the sling, but sometimes, in the early morning or late evening, his siblings would see him on the ridge above the farm, silhouetted against the sky, whirling something over his head with that distinctive whistling sound. And sometimes, impossibly far away, a fence post or rock or tree branch would shatter, struck by something moving too fast to see. The legend of what happened at Hill 487 remained mostly contained within military circles. A few journalists heard rumors, wrote inquiries, got stonewalled by Army public relations. The official position was that Sergeant Hwang had performed admirably in conventional combat operations, and any stories about ancient weapons were embellishments or misunderstandings. But within the military, particularly among special operations communities that were just beginning to form in the 1952nd, David Huang's name became synonymous with unconventional thinking. The idea that a soldier could look outside the standard equipment list, could adapt historical techniques to modern problems, could achieve tactical success through innovation rather than firepower, that idea took root. In 1956, a young captain named William Yarborough, who would later become a founding father of Army Special Forces, read the classified after-action reports from Hill 487. He tracked down David at the farm in California, showed up unannounced, and spent 3 days learning everything David could teach him about sling tactics. "The point isn't the sling," Yarborough said on the third day, as David demonstrated shots at increasingly absurd distances. "The point is the mindset. You didn't accept the limitations you were given. You brought your own solution." "I brought the solution I'd spent 10 years developing," David replied. "That's different from just improvising." "That's exactly my point. Real unconventional warfare isn't about chaos. It's about expertise in unexpected areas. It's about being so good at something weird that it becomes tactically decisive." Yarborough left with pages of notes, sketches of technique, and a profound respect for what could be accomplished with creativity and skill. Some of those ideas would eventually inform the development of modern special operations doctrine, though David Huang's name was never officially attached to any of it. David lived quietly. He married in 1958 a woman named Helen, a teacher from Fresno, who loved that he was gentle and competent and never felt the need to brag. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. He ran the farm until his father died in 1963, then sold it and moved into town, working as a mechanic for 30 years. He never served in the military again, though he received occasional letters from officers he'd served with, men who'd gone on to careers in the Army and wanted to maintain the connection. He attended 2nd Infantry Division reunions, where old men told exaggerated stories about the Korean War and quietly honored the friends who hadn't come home. The sling hung on the wall of his garage, next to his service medals and a faded photograph of Baker Company, 23rd Infantry Regiment, taken somewhere in Korea in 1951. Sometimes his children would ask about it. He'd tell them it was something he'd used on the farm for keeping coyotes away. They never entirely believed him, but they didn't push. David Solomon Huang died in 2008, at age 78, from complications of heart disease. His obituary in the Fresno Bee mentioned his military service briefly. Korean War veteran, decorated for valor. It didn't mention the sling. It didn't mention Hill 487. But at his funeral, 3 men in their 70s attended, men who'd flown in from across the country. They were the surviving members of his fire team from Korea, Murphy, Jensen, and Williams. They stood at the graveside in the California heat, old men remembering when they'd been young and terrified and had watched their corporal do something impossible. "We should tell people," Murphy said quietly. "What he did, what we saw." Williams shook his head. "Nobody would believe it." "We saw it. Doesn't matter. The world doesn't want to believe that a man with rocks and leather could stop an army. It doesn't fit the narrative. It makes all the expensive weapons look stupid." Jensen, who'd been silent, said he didn't care if anyone believed it. He just did what needed doing with what he had. They stood in silence for a moment, 3 old men honoring a 4th, remembering a morning in Korea when the world had made sense for approximately 90 seconds, when skill and courage and a Bronze Age weapon had been enough to change the course of a battle. The official Army history of the Korean War mentions Hill 487 inches a single paragraph. On the 9th of June 1951, Baker Company, 23rd Infantry Regiment, 2nd Infantry Division, successfully repelled a Chinese probe in the Hwacheon Valley sector. Enemy casualties were estimated at 20 to 25. Friendly casualties were minimal. It doesn't mention David Huang. It doesn't mention the sling. It doesn't mention that 28 Chinese soldiers had their assault broken by a shepherd's tool wielded by a man who'd been mocked for carrying it. But in the classified archives, in the after-action reports that only researchers and military historians access, there's a more detailed account. Captain Hendricks' report, filed on June 10, 1951, describes the engagement with clinical precision. Major Patterson's intelligence assessment, filed 2 days later, tries to analyze the tactical and psychological implications. Both reports conclude, with varying degrees of disbelief, that Corporal David S. Huang had accomplished something that shouldn't have been possible. There's a lesson in this story, though it's not the one people usually expect. The lesson isn't that old weapons are better than new ones. They aren't. David carried a rifle because rifles are generally more effective than slings. The M1 Garand had longer range, faster rate of fire, and standardized ammunition. Any reasonable military planner would choose rifles over slings every single time. The lesson isn't that the military should have issued slings. They shouldn't have. Sling expertise takes years to develop, can't be mass-produced, and doesn't scale to modern warfare's logistical requirements. The Army was right to focus on weapons that could be taught quickly and employed effectively by average soldiers. The lesson is about the gap between doctrine and reality, between what the manual says and what the battlefield requires. Every military organization tends toward standardization, toward creating universal solutions that work in most situations. This is necessary and good. You can't run a modern military without standardized training, standardized equipment, standardized procedures. But battlefields aren't standardized. They're chaotic, unpredictable, filled with situations the manual didn't anticipate. And in those gaps, in those specific, unique moments where the standard solution doesn't quite fit, that's where men like David Huang become tactically decisive. He didn't reject the system. He carried his rifle. He followed orders. He executed standard infantry tactics competently and professionally. But he also carried something extra, something the system didn't provide, something he developed on his own through years of obsessive practice. And when the moment came, when the situation presented itself, he had a tool and a skill set that nobody else possessed. That's the real lesson. Don't let doctrine blind you to possibility. The U.S. military learned this lesson slowly, painfully, over decades. The special operations community that emerged from Korea and Vietnam, the emphasis on unconventional warfare, the recognition that sometimes the best soldiers are the weird ones who think differently, all of that was informed, in small ways, by stories like David Huang's. Modern special operations soldiers are taught to look outside the standard equipment list, to adapt civilian tools for military purposes, to develop unusual skill sets that might provide tactical advantage. They're taught that innovation happens at the edge, where doctrine meets improvisation. David would have appreciated that, though he would have been uncomfortable with any attempt to mythologize what he did. He was a practical man. He saw a problem enemy soldiers advancing, and he applied a solution he'd spent years developing. The fact that the solution was 3,000 years old was irrelevant to him, but to everyone else, it mattered. Because it proved something important about warfare, about creativity, about the relationship between ancient wisdom and modern problems. Goliath fell to David not because David was stronger, but because David fought a different fight than Goliath expected. He brought a different weapon, a different strategy, a different understanding of what warfare could be. 3,000 years later, on a Korean hillside in the fog, another David proved the same lesson, that the most dangerous soldiers aren't always the ones with the best weapons, but the ones who understand that warfare is fundamentally about creativity, adaptation, and refusing to accept the limitations others impose on you. The Chinese soldiers who survived the engagement at Hill 487 went home with stories about a ghost soldier, an American demon who killed with invisible weapons and disappeared into the fog. Those stories spread through the Chinese military, became part of the folklore of the Korean War, were told and retold until the truth was buried under layers of myth-making. But the truth was simpler and more profound. A young man from California, armed with leather and stones and 10,000 hours of practice, had stood behind a ruined wall and proven that the oldest weapons, in the right hands, are still deadly. His commanding officers had told him it would never work. His peers had mocked him. The entire modern military establishment had dismissed his weapon as obsolete, irrelevant, a curiosity from a dead age, until the morning when the fog rolled across Hill 487, and 28 Chinese soldiers learned the hard way that some technologies never become obsolete. They just wait for the right moment, the right hands, the right battlefield. David Solomon Huang never bragged about what he'd accomplished. He went home, raised a family, worked an ordinary job, lived an ordinary life. The sling hung on his garage wall, and nobody who didn't know would guess what it had done. But the men who'd been there knew. The officers who'd read the reports knew. The Chinese soldiers who'd survived knew. They knew that on the morning of June 9th, 1951, the battlefield had changed forever, not because of technology or doctrine or training, but because one man had refused to let the world tell him what was possible. No one ever mocked him again. His weapon was ancient, but his legend is eternal.